Joining me now to discuss this is Democratic Senator from Minnesota, Tina Smith. She's also vice chair of the campaign arm for Senate Democrats. Thank you so much for joining me, Senator. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Krista. I'm so glad to be with you.
Well, we are so glad to have you. We're so glad to have your perspective. President Biden, of course, getting ready to deliver his State of the Union address. He is facing, as you know, some headwinds as it relates to the war in the Middle East, as it relates to his age. What do you want to hear from him tonight? What does he need to do to have it be a successful night?
Well, I think the president is going into this evening really ready to make his case to the American people about the progress that we've made, the work that we have left to do, and the great contrast between his approach and the approach of Democrats and the approach of Republicans. I'm expecting him to be very specific about what he has done, what we've done to lower costs for prescription drugs and to expand access to health care, but then also to talk about his vision for what more we need to do to continue to lower costs for prescription drugs, to lower housing costs, to get after this kind of corporate greed that is driving up prices in some areas and leaving a lot of Americans just wondering what the heck is going on.
What do you think he needs to do to quell the concerns about his age? If you look at the polls, more than 70% of Americans say they do have real concerns about his age and his ability to serve a second term.
Well, you know, tonight he is really in his element. He is so comfortable in this building. He is accustomed to the traditions and the kind of way that people behave in this building. And I'll just remind you that last year when he was got some feedback from the audience as he was giving his speech, he really engaged with that. And I think it showed him for the person that he really is, ready to engage, ready to dive into it and ready to make his case. So I feel like he's going to be in a very good place as he goes into the speech tonight. I think that's part of it, but it's also, I think, Americans wanting to hear, like, what does he want to do and where do we go from here as we look towards the coming year?
We had reported that the president is going to talk about the border, but he's not going to unveil any new executive actions, though we know the administration is considering executive actions as it relates to asylum. Do you think that's a mistake to not roll out something new on the border issue tonight, to use this massive platform to address that issue?
Yeah, I mean, here's what I think about that. You know, we have a bipartisan agreement that was struck between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate with a lot of feedback and great support from the White House. And then what happened? Donald Trump and the Republicans said, no, we don't want to actually make progress on the border and on border security. We'd rather keep this as a political issue. And so I think the president has laid out what it is that he believes that needs to happen at the border. Let's just take the issue of stopping the flood of fentanyl at our southern border and the need to have the technology and the border security in place to stop that. We have a plan for that, and the Republicans have said no. So I think he will make that case tonight as well. He should.
And let's talk now about your home state of Minnesota. We saw that uncommitted vote, which we also saw in Michigan, 19% in Minnesota in the Democratic primary. It was a protest vote, effectively, for voters to protest President Biden's handling of the Israel-Gaza war, or Israel-Hamas war, I should say, the war in Gaza. How concerned are you about that being an electoral problem for President Biden come November?
Well, so what I think happened in Minnesota is that, first of all, Minnesota has a long and strong tradition of activism and grassroots organizing. And I think what we saw on Tuesday was people who are just so deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And they wanted to make their voices heard in that election. And that's what happened. And what I have been saying to people, and what I really truly believe, is that the president shares their concerns. He is working hard to reach a place where we can have a stop to the violence, we can have a long ceasefire, we can return the hostages, and then we can move to where we need to get to, which is a way for both Israel and Palestinians in the region to have their own states and where everybody can live in peace and dignity. That is what he is working for. I think in many ways the president shares the concerns of those. But you're asking really an electoral question, which I respect. And my strong view of it is, knowing many of the people who voted uncommitted on Tuesday, is that that is not a reflection of how they intend to vote in November. They understand what that choice is. And they know clearly that if you care about Palestinians in the Middle East, that Donald Trump is a disaster.
Let me ask you about Senator Menendez, if I could, one of your colleagues. He now facing yet another indictment, this time being charged with obstruction of justice. You had previously resisted calls for him to resign. Does this latest indictment change your perspective at all, Senator? Do you think it's time for him to step down?
Well, look, I'm deeply concerned about the allegations around Senator Menendez. I think that it is extremely troubling. To tell you the truth, what I am focused on as I think about my role in the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee is making sure that we win, make sure that Democrats win in New Jersey and that Democrats win around the country so that we can keep and even expand on our majority. And that's where my focus is.
Well, let me ask you this just to follow up. Do you believe the DSCC should provide financial support to Senator Menendez if he does decide to run for re-election? And of course, he hasn't announced that yet.
Yeah, of course he has. And let's just be clear. He hasn't announced what he's going to do. We have two candidates who are running in New Jersey who have announced and who are working really, really hard. And I'm going to let that process play out. And the Democrats and the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee is going to make sure that we win. I would also say that New Jersey has elected a Democrat at the federal level for many, many years. And I think that what we're going to be doing is putting our resources into the states where we need to. I would point you to what happened this weekend in Texas, where we have a very strong candidate ready to challenge Ted Cruz, one of the most unpopular Republicans in the country, who won in a 9-person field, Colin Allred, with almost 60% of the vote. So there are lots of places where we're going to be looking to build our support and, I believe, protect and even expand our majority.
Senator, just to be very clear, I don't hear a yes or a no. Are you willing to go so far as to give a specific answer on that, or you're going to wait till he...
I mean, there's too many hypotheticals involved in that, and who's going to be the candidate, and we're just going to wait and see how that all plans out. But as I said, I don't expect that you're going to see the DSCC putting resources into New Jersey, which is a strong Democratic state where our Democratic candidates typically win.
Let me just get your reaction to Senator Sinema, who became, of course, the latest senator to announce she's not going to seek re-election. I want to read you what Senator Daines, the chair of the NRSC, said. He said, with recent polling showing Kyrsten Sinema pulling far more Republican voters than Democratic voters, her decision to retire improves Kari Lake's opportunity to flip this seat. What do you make of that? What's your response?
Well, that's a noble effort on the part of Senator Daines to put a pretty face on what is a very challenging situation for Republicans in Arizona. With Senator Sinema announcing that she's not planning on running, we have a very strong candidate in Arizona in Ruben Gallegos. And even the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee's own polling shows that Ruben does better in a two-person race, beating Kari Lake, who is kind of the Republicans' worst nightmare. Not only does she deny that Joe Biden won the presidential election, but she denies that she lost the gubernatorial election. So she's running for Senate at the same time she's denying that she lost the governor's race.
All right. Senator Tina Smith, we sure did cover a lot of ground today. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.